The stars still shimmered above the Colorado Rockies when the first sound of the morning drifted across Harper Ranch. Not the ringing of a dinner bell or the shouting of ranch hands, but the soft, familiar whistle of one young cowboy. Before the sun had even touched the eastern horizon, hundreds of cattle slowly lifted their heads in the darkness, recognizing a voice they had trusted for years. Within the hour, that same cowboy would lose his job. Before another hour passed, the entire ranch would witness something no one could explain. Before we continue, if you enjoy heartfelt Western stories filled with unforgettable cowboys, loyal horses, and lessons about courage and character, take a moment to subscribe and join us for every new journey across the American frontier. Now, let us ride to Harper Ranch, where one quiet morning is about to change everything. Long before sunrise, 26-year-old Jacob Carter was already awake. The cool spring air carried the scent of damp grass, fresh earth, and cottonwood blossoms as he stepped from the bunkhouse wearing his weathered tan cowboy hat. Duke, his dependable bay quarter horse, nickered softly from the corral the moment he saw him. "Morning, old friend," Jacob said with a gentle smile. He saddled Duke with practiced hands, checked every leather strap, coiled his rope neatly, and rubbed the horse's neck before climbing into the saddle. Harper Ranch still slept. Lanterns glowed faintly inside the main house, while the eastern sky remained wrapped in darkness. Jacob always liked these quiet hours. The cattle did too. He rode slowly toward the north pasture, giving the same low whistle he had used every morning for nearly 4 years. The lead cows immediately turned their ears toward him. Instead of rushing or crowding one another, they calmly drifted toward the open gate, exactly as they had done hundreds of times before. Jacob never shouted. He never cracked a whip. He simply rode where they expected him to be. The herd trusted the routine. Nearby, 17-year-old Samuel Brooks hurried across the pasture, carrying a feed bucket. He watched with admiration. "I still don't know how you do that." Jacob smiled. "I don't." Samuel frowned. "They listen every time. They're not listening because I'm louder." Jacob guided Duke a few steps forward. "They're listening because they know what comes next." Samuel looked thoughtfully at the moving cattle. "My father always said cattle only understand force." "My father taught me something different." Jacob looked across the slowly moving herd. "He said animals remember the people who make them feel safe." Samuel nodded quietly. "I'd like to learn that someday." "You already are." The peaceful morning was suddenly interrupted by the sound of another horse approaching. Trail boss Thomas Grady rode across the pasture with his usual determined posture. His sandy brown mustache barely moved as he spoke. "Jacob." Jacob tipped his hat respectfully. "Morning, Mr. Grady." Thomas looked across the slowly moving cattle. "They're taking too long." Jacob answered calmly. "They'll reach the holding pens without getting worked up." "We don't have time for slow." Thomas dismounted. "I've watched this long enough." Samuel looked back and forth between the two men. Thomas folded his arms. "Harper Ranch needs somebody who can move cattle quicker." Jacob remained silent. "I'm relieving you of your duties." The words settled heavily in the cool morning air. Samuel stepped forward. "Sir?" Thomas raised one hand. "My decision's already made." Jacob looked neither angry nor surprised. He simply nodded once. "If that's what you believe is best." Thomas seemed almost unsettled by the lack of argument. "I expect you to gather your things and leave before the morning drive begins." Jacob removed his gloves slowly. "You'll have no trouble from me." He walked back toward the bunkhouse. His belongings filled only a single bedroll, 2 weathered saddlebags, a coffee pot, and one small wooden box containing the few personal keepsakes he carried from ranch to ranch. Samuel followed him. "I can't believe he's doing this." Jacob tightened the last saddle strap on Duke. "Sometimes good people make decisions with incomplete information. But it's not fair." Jacob smiled gently. "Life rarely asks whether something is fair." He reached into his pocket and handed Samuel a neatly braided rawhide rein knot. "I made this when I was about your age." Samuel stared at it. "I can't take it. I want you to." The young ranch hand swallowed hard. I'm going to miss working with you." Jacob placed one hand on his shoulder. "Take care of Duke if you ever see him again." "I will." With one final look toward the ranch, Jacob mounted his horse. He tipped his hat politely toward Thomas. Then he turned Duke toward the ranch road leading west. The morning drive finally began. Only something unexpected happened. The first lead cow reached the fork where the herd normally entered the holding pasture. Instead of turning, she stopped. Her ears pointed toward Jacob's familiar whistle drifting on the cool breeze. She quietly stepped after him. Another cow followed, then another. Within moments, dozens of calm cattle had gently drifted away from the planned drive, walking at an easy pace behind Jacob and Duke, exactly as they had done countless mornings before. No running, no panic, no stampede, only quiet trust. Samuel stared in complete disbelief. Thomas shouted commands from horseback, trying to redirect the lead animals, but the more he urged them forward, the more uncertain the cattle became. Just then, another rider appeared at the top of the hill. Benjamin Harper had arrived. The ranch owner pulled his horse to a stop, watching the astonishing sight unfold before him. He looked from the drifting herd to the young cowboy riding slowly away, and quietly asked, "Why are my cattle following the man we just fired?" Benjamin Harper's question hung over the quiet pasture like the first rays of sunrise climbing above the Colorado Rockies. "Why are my cattle following the man we just fired?" No one answered immediately. The herd wasn't charging. They weren't frightened. Nearly 60 head of cattle simply walked behind Jacob Carter at an easy, familiar pace, just as they had every morning when he led them from one pasture to another. Jacob noticed the movement almost at once. He turned Duke around and looked back. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his usually calm face. Then he understood what had happened. He removed his hat and sighed softly. "Oh, no." Without hesitation, he guided Duke toward the front of the drifting cattle. Instead of riding away, he positioned his horse where the lead cows could clearly see him. In the same calm voice he had used for years, he spoke. "Easy now. That's enough." The cattle stopped. They watched him quietly. Jacob gave the familiar low whistle they had always associated with changing direction. Several led cows shifted their weight, but remained standing. Benjamin Harper rode closer, studying every movement. Nothing about Jacob suggested he was trying to steal livestock. In fact, he looked almost embarrassed. Thomas Grady finally reached them, breathing hard after trying unsuccessfully to turn the herd. "You planned this." Jacob looked at him steadily. "No, sir. You whistled for them." "I whistled for them to stop." Thomas pointed toward the cattle. "They're following you." Jacob nodded once. "I can see that." Benjamin raised one hand before Thomas could continue. "Enough." The ranch owner slowly rode his horse between both men. "I want to understand this before anyone says another word." The pasture became quiet again. Samuel Brooks finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Mr. Harper?" Benjamin looked toward the young ranch hand. "I've worked beside Jacob every morning since I came here." He glanced toward the cattle. "They've followed those same whistles for years." Thomas folded his arms. "So you're saying cattle fired him too?" Samuel shook his head. "No, sir. I'm saying they don't understand what happened." Benjamin looked thoughtfully across the herd. Most of the animals stood peacefully grazing now. A few continued watching Jacob. The ranch owner frowned. "They aren't acting frightened." "No." "They're not excited." "No." Benjamin looked directly at Jacob. "Would they normally follow you like this?" Jacob answered honestly. "If I was moving them between pastures, yes." Benjamin remained silent. Just then, another rider appeared along the eastern trail. Doc Henry Walker guided his gray gelding into the pasture carrying his familiar leather veterinary bag. The elderly veterinarian smiled as he approached. "I saw cattle standing where they usually don't." He looked around. "I figured something unusual must be happening." Benjamin greeted him. "Your timing couldn't be better." Doc Henry quietly observed the herd for several moments. Then he looked toward Jacob. You've been handling these cattle for quite a while. Nearly 4 years. The old veterinarian nodded. I thought so. Thomas crossed his arms. Can you explain this? Doc Henry climbed down from his horse. I believe I can. He walked slowly toward one of the older Hereford cows. She remained perfectly calm. You gentlemen spend a great deal of time thinking cattle respond to force. He gently stroked the cow's neck. They don't. Everyone listened carefully. They respond to habits. Benjamin leaned forward slightly. Doc Henry continued. Every morning this young man arrived before sunrise. He pointed toward Jacob. He opened the same gates, rode the same horse, used the same whistle, spoke with the same calm voice. He smiled gently. For years. Thomas frowned. So? The veterinarian looked directly at him. These animals learned those signals meant safety. They learned where food waited. They learned where fresh water was. Benjamin slowly nodded. So when Jacob rode away this morning, they simply followed the routine they trusted. Doc Henry smiled. Exactly. There isn't anything mysterious about it. It's good livestock handling. Silence settled over the pasture. Benjamin looked toward Jacob with entirely new eyes. Thomas lowered his gaze. He hesitated. I thought moving them faster was the better way. Jacob answered quietly. Sometimes faster works. But frightened cattle remember fear. The old veterinarian smiled approvingly. And calm cattle remember trust. Benjamin looked once more across the scattered herd. Can you return them? Jacob hesitated. If you'd like. I'm asking. Jacob tipped his hat politely. Yes, sir. He gently turned Duke toward the lead cows. No shouting. No whip. No rushing. He simply rode where the cattle expected him to be. Come on, girls. His familiar whistle drifted across the spring pasture. The lead cow immediately turned. One by one, the others followed. Within only a few minutes, the entire herd quietly drifted back toward the correct holding pasture. The movement looked almost effortless. Samuel smiled. I've never seen anything like it. Neither had Benjamin Harper. He watched Jacob guide hundreds of cattle with nothing more than patience, positioning, and trust. There was no confusion, no pushing, no frightened animals, only calm order. When the final cow entered the holding pasture, Jacob rode back toward Benjamin. I believe they're settled now. Benjamin removed his gloves slowly. You've done me a favor. Jacob shook his head. I did it for the cattle. He looked once toward the peaceful herd. They didn't know anything had changed. Benjamin remained thoughtful for several long moments. Finally he spoke. Jacob? The young cowboy waited. I think. He paused, looking across the quiet pasture where every animal now grazed peacefully. I may have misunderstood what kind of cowboy I've been watching all these years. Benjamin Harper's final words lingered in the cool spring air. I may have misunderstood what kind of cowboy I've been watching all these years. Jacob Carter lowered his eyes respectfully. We all make mistakes, Mr. Harper. Benjamin studied the young cowboy for another quiet moment. I appreciate what you did today. Jacob tipped his hat. I'm glad the herd settled. Without another word, he turned Duke toward the western trail once again. This time, no cattle followed. They calmly remained in the holding pasture, exactly where they belonged. Jacob smiled to himself. That was how it should be. He disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees, while Harper Ranch slowly returned to its ordinary routine. Yet something inside Benjamin Harper refused to settle quite so easily. Shit. The following morning, Benjamin stood alone beside the north pasture long before sunrise. For years he had trusted reports from foremen and trail bosses. This morning, he decided to trust his own eyes. He quietly rode across neighboring ranches, where Jacob had found temporary work, repairing fences, and helping move small groups of cattle. Jacob never knew Benjamin was watching. He simply worked. At one ranch, an anxious mare refused to allow anyone near her injured colt. Jacob approached slowly. He removed his gloves. spoke softly, waited patiently. Within minutes, the mare relaxed enough for Doc Henry Walker to examine the young horse safely. Benjamin noticed something. Jacob hadn't forced cooperation. He had earned it. Later that afternoon, Benjamin watched Jacob helping an elderly rancher whose wagon wheel had broken along the trail. Without being asked, Jacob unloaded heavy supplies, repaired the axle, and refused payment beyond a simple handshake. Benjamin quietly smiled. He never looks for recognition. FUD. Back at Harper Ranch, Emily Harper noticed her father sitting unusually quietly on the porch after supper. She carried 2 cups of coffee outside. "You've been thinking." Benjamin accepted the cup with a grateful smile. "I have." Emily sat beside him. "You went looking for Jacob today." Benjamin looked surprised. "How did you know?" She laughed softly. "You wore your traveling coat. And you came home asking more questions than you left with." Benjamin looked toward the distant mountains. "I've spent years believing good leadership meant giving orders." Emily listened patiently. "I watched Jacob today. He never once told anyone he was important. He simply helped wherever he was needed." She nodded gently. "That's why people trust him." Benjamin looked thoughtful. Emily continued, "Titles don't make leaders. They simply describe them." Her father remained silent. "The ranch hands followed your instructions because they had to." She smiled softly. "They followed Jacob because they wanted to." Those words stayed with Benjamin long after the conversation ended. Several days later, Samuel Brooks found Jacob repairing a split corral gate on a neighboring homestead. The young ranch hand had ridden nearly an hour just to see him. "I hoped I'd find you." Jacob smiled warmly. "You usually do." Samuel climbed down from his horse. "I've been practicing." "The whistle?" Samuel nodded proudly. Jacob laughed. "Let's hear it." The boy tried. The sound came out uneven and far too loud. Jacob chuckled kindly. "We'll keep working on that." For the next hour, Jacob showed Samuel how small movements often mattered more than loud commands. He explained how horses watched body position, how cattle noticed pressure long before they noticed noise, how patience often solved problems that force only made worse. Finally, Samuel asked the question that had been weighing on his heart. "How do you make people trust you?" Jacob leaned against the fence. "You don't make them." Samuel frowned. "I don't understand." "You give them reasons." The boy remained quiet. Jacob smiled. "If people know you'll stay calm, tell the truth. Keep your promises, and stand beside them when things become difficult. They'll decide for themselves." Samuel thought carefully about every word. "So leadership isn't about being in charge." Jacob shook his head. "It's about helping others feel safe enough to do their best." The young ranch hand smiled. "I think that's the most important thing you've ever taught me." That evening, Benjamin Harper unlocked the ranch office after everyone else had gone home. Dust floated through the fading sunlight as he opened decades of carefully organized ranch ledgers. He wasn't searching for money. He was searching for patterns. Year after year, he compared records: livestock losses, injuries, broken fences, stampedes, delayed cattle drives. Slowly, one detail became impossible to ignore. Whenever Jacob supervised the early morning herd movements, accidents dropped. Lost calves became rare. Veterinary costs decreased. Even the horses required fewer treatments after difficult drives. Benjamin leaned back heavily in his chair. It was never luck. He closed the ledger quietly. It was leadership. For several minutes, he stared through the office window toward the empty north pasture where Jacob had once begun every sunrise. Finally, he stood. He reached for his riding coat. Before leaving, he paused only long enough to write one short note for Thomas Grady. "Some mistakes belong to all of us. Tomorrow, we begin correcting one." Before dawn could arrive the next morning, Benjamin Harper saddled his horse himself. As the first pale light touched the eastern sky, he rode alone toward the small cabin where Jacob Carter had been staying. He wasn't riding to hire another cowboy. He was riding to ask a leader to come home. The first light of dawn stretched across the Colorado Rockies as Benjamin Harper guided his horse toward the small cabin where Jacob Carter had spent the past few nights. The valley was quiet, except for meadowlarks greeting the morning and the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the dew-covered trail. Jacob had already been awake for nearly an hour. Just as he always had, he had fed Duke before preparing his own breakfast. A small coffee pot rested over a modest campfire beside the cabin while he tightened the cinch on his saddle, expecting another ordinary day's work on a neighboring ranch. When he saw Benjamin riding through the gate, he set down his coffee cup. "Good morning, Mr. Harper." Benjamin removed his black felt hat before speaking. "Morning, Jacob." For a few moments, neither man spoke. The silence carried no discomfort, only honesty. Benjamin finally stepped down from his horse. "I owe you something." Jacob shook his head gently. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Benjamin looked directly into the young cowboy's eyes. "I judged your work without taking the time to understand it. I trusted opinions more than my own observation. And because of that," he paused, "I let the best cowboy on my ranch ride away." Jacob remained quiet. Benjamin continued, "I'm sorry." The words came without excuses, without pride, without hesitation. Jacob smiled softly. "Thank you." Benjamin took one slow breath. "I didn't come here simply to apologize." He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a neatly written document. "I'd like you to come back to Harper Ranch." Jacob looked surprised. As head livestock foreman, Benjamin smiled. "I don't need someone who can shout louder. I need someone who can teach. Someone who understands animals. Someone young cowboys can learn from." Jacob lowered his eyes for a moment. "I never expected that." Benjamin laughed quietly. "Neither did I." Jacob looked toward Duke, grazing peacefully nearby, then back toward Benjamin. "If I come back, I'd like Thomas Grady to stay." Benjamin looked surprised. "After everything?" Jacob nodded. "He cares about the ranch. He simply learned differently than I did. I'd rather work beside him than replace him." Benjamin smiled. "I believe that's exactly why you're the right man." Later that morning, two riders entered Harper Ranch side by side. Word spread quickly. Ranch hands stopped repairing fences. Stable boys stepped outside the barns. Kitchen workers looked through open windows. Samuel Brooks spotted Jacob first. His face lit up. "He came back!" The young ranch hand hurried across the yard before Jacob had even dismounted. "I knew you would." Jacob laughed. "I wasn't so sure myself." Emily Harper stepped onto the porch beside her father. "It's good to have you home." Jacob tipped his hat respectfully. "It's good to be here." A moment later, Thomas Grady approached slowly. His usual stern expression seemed unusually uncertain. He stopped a few feet away. "I owe you an apology." Jacob listened quietly. "I mistook patience for weakness," Thomas admitted. "I've spent most of my life believing the loudest cowboy was the strongest one." He looked toward the nearby pasture. "You proved me wrong." Jacob extended his hand. "We both learned something." Thomas smiled for the first time in many days. He shook Jacob's hand firmly. "No hard feelings?" Jacob smiled. "None." Around them, several ranch hands quietly nodded with relief. The ranch somehow felt lighter. Fuff. Weeks passed. Spring settled fully across the Colorado Valley. Green grass covered the hillsides. Wildflowers bloomed beside winding creeks. Every sunrise now found Jacob exactly where he loved to be, on horseback with young ranch hands riding beside him. But he rarely spoke first. Instead, he asked questions. "What do you notice? What are the cattle telling us? Why do you think that horse moved?" Samuel answered more confidently with every passing day. One morning he successfully guided a small group of nervous yearlings through a narrow gate without shouting once. Jacob smiled proudly. "You barely touched the reins." Samuel grinned. They already knew where they were going. Jacob nodded. "You finally understand." Benjamin and Emily watched from the hillside overlooking the pasture. Emily smiled. You didn't just bring back a foreman. Benjamin quietly folded his arms. No, I brought back the future of this ranch. Several weeks later, Harper Ranch began its largest spring cattle drive of the season. Hundreds of Hereford and Angus cattle filled the open valley beneath brilliant blue skies. Benjamin gathered every ranch hand before the drive began. Then, without saying a word, he turned toward Jacob. You'll lead today. Jacob looked almost embarrassed. Mr. Harper. Benjamin smiled. I insist. Jacob tipped his weathered tan hat. Yes, sir. He gently nudged Duke forward. No whistle. No shouting. No hurried commands. Only quiet confidence. Only quiet confidence. The lead cattle lifted their heads. They saw the familiar horse, the familiar posture, the familiar calm. One by one, they stepped forward. The rest of the herd followed in smooth, peaceful formation across the green Colorado pasture. Samuel rode nearby with quiet pride. Thomas Grady watched with genuine admiration. Emily smiled. Benjamin Harper removed his hat as he watched the long line of cattle move almost effortlessly beneath the bright spring sun. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Benjamin quietly said, We thought the herd followed a cowboy. He smiled as Jacob continued leading with the same quiet humility that had never changed. Now I know they were following a leader. Jacob heard the words but simply smiled to himself. He wasn't riding to earn praise. He wasn't riding to prove anyone wrong. He was doing what he had always done, guiding others with patience, trust, and steady hands. As Duke carried him across the wide Colorado prairie, surrounded by a peaceful herd and friends who finally understood his gift, Jacob realized something no title could ever give him. He had not merely found another job. He had found a place where his leadership was recognized, his character was valued, and his quiet way of doing things had become the heart of Harper Ranch. Beneath the endless western sky, the young cowboy rode forward, not because anyone ordered others to follow him, but because true leaders rarely need to ask. They simply show the way.